Get ready for some terrifying cemetery stories that'll make you think twice before walking among the graves at night. Like the one you're about to hear, where two friends stumbled upon a remote cemetery hiding dark rituals and something far more dangerous than silence. But before we dive into the story, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss any of our terrifying tales, and drop a comment telling me which city or country you're watching from. On that late afternoon, the wind seemed to carry a different weight. The kind of breeze that doesn't refresh, only chills. Mark and I were in the car, driving down a narrow road that cut through a nearly forgotten part of town. Our destination was a small cemetery lost in the middle of nowhere, which he had discovered on a forum of curious places to visit. But when we parked near the rusty iron gate, I realized that the word curious didn't do the place justice. The cemetery was surrounded by a dense forest, the trees so tall that they blocked out most of the light. To the right, an abandoned building stood with its broken windows and peeling walls, as if no one had gone near it for decades. The silence there wasn't just an absence of sound. It was a heavy silence, almost as if something was paying attention. Mark was excited, laughing, saying it would make for great photos, but with every step I took, I felt like I was crossing an invisible line into a place where we shouldn't be. We entered through the gate, which creaked loudly, and started walking down the stone path covered in dry leaves. The gravestones were old, some toppled over, others covered in moss. Names almost faded, dates from the past century, and every now and then, that strange feeling that something was moving in my peripheral vision. It wasn't just my imagination. I felt, almost physically, a spiritual presence watching us. Mark seemed not to notice and wandered off, exploring every corner, while I tried to keep my gaze fixed ahead to avoid looking directly at the shadows among the trees. That's when I began to notice that the air was changing. A strange smell, a mix of wet earth and something else, like iron or rust. At the same time, a weight on my chest began to tighten, and a negative energy seemed to spread through the environment. I looked at the abandoned building, and for an instant, I swear I saw a figure standing in the window on the second floor, motionless, staring at me. I blinked and there was nothing, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. Mark shouted my name, calling me to see a broken cross near the back wall. When I reached him, I noticed that the wall led to a stretch of forest where the undergrowth was so dense that hardly any light entered. And it was there, in the middle of the vegetation, that we saw a quick movement. At first, I thought it was an animal, but no. An elderly man with pale skin and dirty clothes emerged from among the trees. He wasn't walking. He was advancing as if in a hurry, his wide eyes fixed on us. "Get out of here!" he shouted, his voice hoarse and furious. "Don't you understand?" Mark took a step back, but I was paralyzed. There was something about him, a mix of desperation and anger, that left me without reaction. The old man began to approach, and I felt my legs grow heavy, as if the ground was pulling me down. It was as if the energy of that place was draining my strength. My field of vision began to narrow, and everything around me became more distant, muffled. I heard Mark shout my name again, but the sound seemed to come from underwater. Before I could understand what was happening, everything went dark. The last image I saw was the man reaching out his hand to me, and the world disappeared. When I regained consciousness, I was on the cold ground, my mouth dry and my head throbbing. I felt a tug on my arm and realized that Mark was dragging me hurriedly, his face pale and his eyes wide. He kept looking back, as if expecting something to catch up to us. I was still too dazed to speak, but his urgency made me understand that something had happened while I was unconscious. And it was only when we got near the gate that I saw, out of the corner of my eye, the abandoned building again. One of the ground floor windows was open, and inside, even in the dim light, you could make out something hanging, like old dolls, arranged in a strange way, looking out. Mark didn't slow down until we were completely out of the cemetery gate. I was still stunned, with wobbly legs and blurred vision, but I realized he didn't want to stop there. He pulled me down the dirt road, ignoring my request to wait a bit. His breathing was rapid, almost panting, and there was a tremor in his voice when he finally said, "We can't stay here. Not now." It was a few seconds before I could formulate a question, but even before I opened my mouth, Mark cast a quick glance back and signaled me to follow. At the corner of the road, almost touching the forest, the old man was standing, motionless, as if he had sprouted there from nowhere. He wasn't shouting anymore. He just stared at us. And that look, it seemed to pierce the skin and stir something deep inside, where you don't even know you can feel pain. When we were far enough away for his figure to disappear into the distance, Mark finally stopped. He was sweating cold and told me, almost in a whisper, what he had seen while I was unconscious. He said that when I fell to the ground, the old man approached as if to grab me. Mark ran to reach me but noticed a glow inside the abandoned building. He didn't know how to explain it, but something inside him urged him to look. Inside, in the middle of a dark room, there was a symbol painted on the floor with what appeared to be dried blood. Around it, several old dolls, all with torn clothes and dirty faces, were positioned in a circle. Their heads turned towards the center, as if watching something invisible. In the corner, a pile of melted candles and burnt wood remains indicated that someone had performed rituals there. How long ago, he couldn't say. As he watched, Mark felt an intense cold rise up his back, and it was at that moment that he realized the old man was crossing the cemetery courtyard towards me. He ran, placed himself between us, and shouted for him to let me go, even though I don't remember being touched. The old man responded with an incoherent phrase, something like, "You shouldn't have seen," and then slowly retreated, disappearing among the trees. I didn't know what to say. A part of me wanted to believe that Mark was exaggerating, that it was just his imagination under tension. But another part, the larger one, felt that everything made sense in a horrible way. Since we arrived, the negative energy of that place was clear. Now, it was impossible not to connect the dots. The isolated cemetery, the abandoned building, the strange man, and the satanic ritual. Everything seemed to be part of the same web. We hurried back to the car. With every step, I felt a weight on my back as if we were being followed. The sound of dry leaves under our feet seemed louder than it should have been, and at times I swore I heard a second set of footsteps that weren't ours. When we finally got into the car, Mark started the engine without saying a word. The road out seemed longer than the way in. The dense forest on either side became almost a dark tunnel, and the light of the late afternoon was fading too quickly. At one point, I looked in the rearview mirror and thought I saw something moving in the middle of the road behind us. It wasn't an animal. It was taller, more upright. But when I blinked, there was nothing. I tried to convince myself that it was just the effect of the scare, but my body said otherwise. My heart wouldn't slow down, my head was throbbing, and there was a strange taste in my mouth, like metal. Mark was also restless, gripping the steering wheel tightly, his eyes fixed on the road. When I asked if he had seen anything in the rearview mirror, he just shook his head, but I know when he's lying. A few minutes later, we reached a busier road. It was like crossing an invisible barrier. The air seemed lighter, and the pressure on my chest decreased. But the confusion didn't. I still can't understand how I passed out like that. I don't remember tripping or feeling pain before fainting. Just that tightness, the darkening of my vision, and the old man approaching. What scares me the most is that, even far from there, the feeling of being watched hasn't gone away. In the following days, I woke up several times at night with the impression that there was someone standing in the corner of the room, motionless, just staring at me in the dark. And every time I closed my eyes, the image of the dolls in a circle came back with disturbing clarity. I can't explain it. I don't know if it was an ancient ritual, something that still happens, or if we were just unlucky enough to arrive at the wrong time. What I do know is that that cemetery and the building beside it holds something that doesn't want to be found. Something that isn't confined to that patch of land. And no matter how much I try to move on, a part of me feels that since that day, I carry something that I didn't bring back with me. But that came along anyway. Creepy, right? What did you think of the story? On a scale from 0 to 10, how would you rate it? Leave your opinion in the comments. If what they saw in that cemetery already felt like something out of a horror movie, wait until you hear what happened to a group of friends who decided to spend Halloween among the tombstones. In the next story, a simple cell phone recording revealed something that should have never been seen. It was supposed to be just another one of those silly nights where you think you're having fun, but the next day you realize how reckless you were. Halloween always had this kind of mocking vibe for me, putting on a cheap costume, drinking too much, and laughing at horror stories that everyone swears are real. But that year, Josh came up with a great idea to go through the old town cemetery after midnight. According to him, it would make for funny Instagram videos, maybe even some scary photos to post. I, already a few beers in, ended up agreeing. Michael did too. Nobody there thought about the weight a place like that carries, let alone the stories you only hear from older folks. The cemetery was in a more secluded part of town, surrounded by old walls and a rusty iron gate. The streets around were empty, with only the distant sound of music coming from some party. We walked, slightly stumbling and laughing loudly, until we got close. The gate, which is always locked, that night was just slightly ajar. It was almost like an invitation, or looking back now, maybe a warning. Josh pushed it slowly, and the creaking echoed through the place. That sound of iron scraping through the silence of the early morning gave me chills that not even the alcohol could mask. Inside, the air felt heavier. The tall grass hid some of the tombstones, and among the trees you could see those old sculptures, already covered in moss. We took out our iPhones and turned on the flashlights, which cut through the darkness with narrow beams. Michael started reading the names on the tombstones out loud as if it were funny. I, on the other hand, started paying attention to something that didn't make sense. The total absence of sound. No wind, no crickets, not even the rustle of leaves. It was as if everything inside was trapped in a bubble. Josh suggested I start filming to document the adventure. I turned on the camera and started walking, focusing on the sculptures and the details of the strangest tombstones. It was bizarre how the flashlight's light seemed weaker in the video, as if something was absorbing part of it. As I filmed, I slowly turned the camera to the left, and that's when I noticed something weird. In the background, between two tombstones, there was a figure. Tall, motionless, wearing a white dress. At the moment, I thought it was a statue we hadn't seen before, but when I looked with my own eyes, it wasn't there. I turned the phone back to the same spot, and there it was again, standing, looking in my direction. My stomach turned instantly. I blinked, shook the phone, tried to adjust the focus. The image became clearer, and I swear I could see the outline of the face, pale, as if covered by a very thin veil. The strangest thing is that none of us commented on it, because I still hadn't said anything to them. Maybe it was the alcohol, maybe it was fear of seeming paranoid, but I decided to keep filming, trying to understand what was happening. As I kept walking, still filming, I realized that the figure seemed closer in the video than before. There was no perceptible movement of legs or body, but the distance between us was clearly decreasing. The feeling of negative energy increased, as if the air around me had become denser. My heart raced, and I started to feel that classic sensation of being watched, but in an almost physical way, as if something was right behind me, breathing on my neck. The difference was that when I looked over my shoulder, there was nothing there. I tried to convince myself that it was some kind of reflection, maybe a camera glitch, but I couldn't ignore the fact that the flashlight's light seemed to flee from that figure, leaving it shrouded in a strange shadow, even though it was in the middle of the beam. While my friends continued exploring, laughing, and commenting on the oldest tombstones, I was stuck on that image, unable to stop filming. With every step I took, it seemed clearer on the screen. The extremely pale skin, almost bluish, the long hair falling over the shoulders, and that dress that looked wet, clinging to the thin body. It was at that moment that my breathing started to falter. Logic told me there was nothing there. After all, I looked directly at the spot and saw only emptiness. But on the phone, she was getting closer and closer, as if it were a matter of seconds before she filled the entire screen. A chill ran up my spine, and I felt my hands start to tremble. Still, I kept filming, maybe out of pure disbelief, maybe because part of me wanted to be sure I wasn't imagining it all. And that's exactly when I realized I wouldn't be able to keep that up for much longer. Something inside me said that if I waited a few more seconds, there wouldn't be time to get out of there. The sense of urgency took over me. I held the phone tighter and called out to Josh and Michael, but my voice came out strange, muffled, as if the air was heavier inside that cemetery. They didn't respond immediately, and that increased the panic even more. I looked again at the screen. The woman was much closer now, her face more visible. It was too pale, with eyes so dark they looked like two holes. The mouth was slightly open, and something in me said she wasn't just looking at me. She recognized me. It was at that moment that my body decided to act before my mind could. I turned around and started running down the narrow path between the tombstones, screaming for my friends. With each step, I felt as if my feet were sinking further into the damp ground, as if the soil itself was trying to hold me back. I passed by a row of old graves and saw the light of their flashlights further ahead. I ran until I reached them, and they looked at me, scared, not understanding anything. "We need to get out of here now," I said, breathless, pointing to the gate. Josh tried to laugh, saying I was exaggerating, but before he could finish the sentence, I heard a sound coming from behind me. It was as if someone was dragging heavy fabric across the ground, mixed with a low noise, almost a whisper. The sound made all of us fall silent. Michael, who was closer, took my phone to see what I was filming. As soon as he looked at the screen, his smile disappeared. "Dude, what is this?" he asked, taking 2 steps back. I didn't wait for an answer. I snatched the phone from his hand and, without even thinking, started running towards the gate, feeling like that thing was getting closer and closer. The creaking of the iron as I pushed the gate was almost a relief, but it also gave me the feeling that if I had waited one more second, I wouldn't have gotten out of there. Already outside, with my heart still racing, I looked back. The cemetery was once again silent, motionless. No sign of the woman. I wanted to believe it had been a hallucination, an effect of the alcohol, but something inside me knew it wasn't. Later, at Josh's house, we decided to review the video. We sat on the couch with the lights off and I pressed play. At first, it seemed normal. Tombstones, trees, the beam of the flashlight. But then, she appeared, and this time, without the pressure of the moment, we could clearly see that the woman wasn't walking. She was floating towards me. The dress moved as if it were submerged in water, and the face. That face seemed more and more defined, closer and closer. In the instant before I turned the camera and started running, her eyes fixed directly on the lens, and a slow smile began to form. Josh pressed pause, and no one said anything for a few seconds. The silence was only broken when I tried to press play again, and the phone turned off by itself. I tried to turn it on several times, but it didn't respond. It was as if the battery had died, but I knew it was charged. The next day, even when I put it to charge, the iPhone simply wouldn't turn on again. We discussed for hours whether that could have been a real person, someone playing a prank, or if we had seen something that shouldn't have been there. No theory could explain how she only appeared in the video and not in front of our eyes. To this day, when I think about that night, the memory that scares me the most isn't the image of her in the video. It's the look. That wasn't a lost or empty look. It was as if she was marking me, as if in some way I had entered the field of vision of something that doesn't forget. And the worst part is that since then, sometimes I feel that I'm still being watched. Chilling, isn't it? After that night, they never stepped foot in a cemetery again. But others, driven by curiosity, still take the risk. In the next story, you'll see how 2 young men ended up in the wrong place at the wrong time, and found themselves being followed by something not human. That part of town always had a heavy vibe, like time moved slower there and the air was thicker. It wasn't just because of the poverty or the old creaky wooden houses, but because everything seemed to carry too many stories. The cemetery sat atop a hill, surrounded by a tall wall and rusty iron gates. During the day, it already gave off a strange energy. At night, it became something else entirely. Raphael and I, in our complete lack of judgment, decided it would be a great idea to explore the place at 3 in the morning. There was no challenge or bet involved, just pure curiosity. And maybe a sick need to feel real fear. The main gate was locked, but we knew of a side where the iron fence had bent bars. That's where we entered, trying to be quiet, as if we feared being caught by someone. Though in reality, the real fear was of being noticed by something. The first part of the cemetery seemed almost peaceful, with relatively recent gravestones, but all it took was crossing a path of uneven stones to reach the older section. An inner fence, even more rusted, separated that area as if it were a world apart. Crossing that fence was like moving from a heavy atmosphere to a suffocating one. The ground was covered in dry leaves and moss, the gravestones crooked, some with deep cracks, and iron crosses barely standing. The vegetation seemed denser, as if the trees wanted to protect what was buried there. It was impossible to ignore the feeling of being watched. With every step, my eyes were drawn to the shadows between the graves, convinced that something was moving. We walked slowly, whispering about the old dates carved into the stones, some from the 19th century, when suddenly, a sound broke the silence. A child's laughter. It wasn't loud or hysterical, but clear and close. We both froze. My first thought was that it could be an electronic toy, one of those that emit random sounds, but who would leave something like that in a cemetery? I looked at Raphael, and he had the same expression as me, a mix of disbelief and alertness. We continued, trying to rationalize, but it was impossible to ignore the constant chill on the back of our necks. A few meters ahead, Raphael stopped abruptly and fixed his gaze to the left. I followed his gaze and saw a shadow, tall and elongated, standing between two gravestones. It wasn't static like a stone. It seemed to move slightly, like smoke against the non-existent light. But there was no wind. I felt my stomach sink. It was the kind of spiritual presence you only hear about in stories, but at that moment, it felt all too real. As we tried to decide whether to turn back or continue, the dry sound of leaves being crushed came from behind. It wasn't the soft rustling of the wind. It was footsteps. Slow, firm. I didn't need to say anything, and neither did Raphael. We turned and started walking fast, trying not to run immediately so as not to seem like we were desperately fleeing, until the laughter returned, this time clearer, as if it were right behind us. That's when any plan of keeping calm went out the window. We ran toward the fence, and each step seemed accompanied by that sound. Our rapid breathing didn't drown out the noise, and our hearts pounded in our chests. We struggled through the iron, scratching our arms, and headed straight down the path to where we had left the car. We got in hastily, and I didn't even care about starting the engine before closing the doors. Raphael kept looking through the rear window, pale, while I tried to breathe deeply. We drove without exchanging a word until we reached a gas station a few miles away. Only when I stopped, with the cold lights illuminating the car, did I realize that the rear doors were open. Not unlocked. Open. The sensation of negative energy filled the air again, as if something had followed us there. My first impulse was to close them quickly, but I stood there looking for a few seconds, expecting to see, I don't know what. Raphael slammed the door shut and said it was best we left right away. We went home, each trying to process it in our own way. We didn't talk about what we saw, as if naming it would make it all too real. But that night, already in my bed, even with the lights off and the window locked, I couldn't sleep. The laughter still echoed in my head. I wondered if it had just been exaggerated fear, or if in fact there was something in that forgotten part of the cemetery that preferred no one left once they had entered. And if that was the case, did we really manage to leave? That's just bizarre. They managed to get out, but not everyone's that lucky. Some people work every day surrounded by graves and presences that don't always belong to the living. Like in the story you're about to hear now, where a cemetery caretaker had to face something he'll never be able to explain. But before we continue, if you've made it this far, it means you're enjoying these stories. So go ahead and hit the like button so YouTube knows you want more creepy content like this. On that afternoon, the sky seemed lower, heavy as if it wanted to crush everything beneath it. Dark clouds gathered quickly, and the wind carried that smell of rain mixed with wet earth. The same scent I notice every time a storm is about to break over the cemetery. I was already used to this gloomy weather, but something about that day felt different. It wasn't just the weather. There was a pressure in the air, a strange energy, as if the place itself knew that something important or dangerous was about to happen. My job as the cemetery operations coordinator was, theoretically, simple. Ensure everything ran smoothly during burials, supervise interments, and keep the place safe and organized. But over the years, I realized that certain situations didn't follow the manual, and that particular funeral started off heavy. Anthony, a man I recognized by sight, had bought a burial plot days earlier. He said his father was very ill and that he wanted to get everything settled. He spoke about death with an almost unsettling calm, as if he had already accepted it, as if he had made peace with the inevitable. When the day came, the rain didn't let up. Umbrellas bent in the wind, and the water stung everyone's faces like icy needles. I followed the procession to the plot, making sure everything went smoothly. Anthony was serious but didn't cry. His eyes remained fixed on the casket, as if trying to memorize every detail or perhaps silently conversing with his father one last time. As the earth covered the casket, a thunderclap exploded in the sky, so loud it made everyone flinch. It felt like a warning, a message, though I couldn't say from whom or what. After everyone left, I got into the truck to do the routine inspection. I like to take one last round before closing the gate, especially on stormy days, to ensure no one is left behind. The rain pounded hard on the windshield, and the wipers could barely keep up. I drove slowly down the paths, looking at the tombstones on either side. That's when I saw someone, a figure in the distance walking among the graves. It was impossible to make out details with so much rain, but they seemed tall, wearing a dark overcoat. I turned on the high beams and headed in that direction, but when I arrived, there was no one, not a shadow. Just Anthony's funeral flowers swaying in the wind, drenched. I went to the security room to check the cameras. With the storm, the footage was full of interference. Lightning streaking across the screen, water blurs. I reviewed the moment I thought I had seen someone, but all that appeared were shapes formed by the movement of the trees and the distortion of the rain. No body, no face. I knew what I had seen, or at least thought I did. But the camera confirmed nothing. I took a deep breath and tried not to dwell on it. It had been a long day, and my mind might have been playing tricks on me. As I prepared to close the cemetery, I heard a loud bang from the viewing room. It sounded like the door had slammed shut with great force. Annoyed, I imagined some employee had forgotten to lock it properly. I opened the door and froze. In the center of the room, standing, was a man. He looked at me with a blank expression. But the face was the same as Anthony's father. The same man I had seen inside the casket hours before. His clothes were dry, which was impossible with that storm outside, and he seemed solid, real. But there was something wrong with his eyes. They didn't blink, they didn't shine. They were dull, almost lifeless. My first instinct was to speak, but my voice simply wouldn't come out. I took a step forward, and in that same second he vanished. It wasn't like he had run or hidden. He simply wasn't there anymore. 1 second, he was in the center of the room. The next, there was only heavy silence and the strong smell of wet earth. My heart beat so fast I could feel the blood pulsing in my temples. I looked around, opened the back door, checked every corner. Nothing. No sign that anyone had been there. I left the room, trying to keep my composure, but with that unbearable feeling of being watched. I closed the cemetery gate and drove home, but the road seemed longer than usual. With every lightning flash, I thought I saw silhouettes on the sides of the road. Some were just trees. Others, I wasn't so sure. Sleeping that night was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that man's face, or whatever it was, standing there, staring at me with those lifeless eyes. In the following days, I tried to rationalize what had happened. I blamed fatigue, the weather, even the reflection of lights on the water. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't erase the clarity of that figure from my memory. I knew I hadn't imagined it, and somehow I felt that it wasn't over. There was a strange energy clinging to me since that day, a spiritual presence that seemed to follow me, silent, waiting. The cemetery, which had always been a place of respect and quiet, now seemed alive, watching, as if it had recognized in me more than just an employee. As if on that stormy day I had crossed an invisible line from which I could never return. Terrifying, right? What did you think of this story? On a scale from 0 to 10, how would you rate it? Leave your thoughts in the comments. The rain was coming down so hard that day it felt like the sky had decided to open up completely, pouring every last drop it had saved just for me. The car's windshield fought against the dense curtain of rain, but it didn't help much. Every blur the water left made the world outside seem more distorted, almost unreal. I didn't want to go to the cemetery in that weather, but I had promised myself I would visit my grandfather's grave that day, and breaking that promise felt wrong. Maybe because, in a strange way, I felt like he was waiting for me. When I parked near the iron gate, the cold wind slipped through the cracks in my coat. The air was heavy, as if it carried not just humidity, but something invisible, an unsettling energy that seeped into my bones. The cemetery seemed even darker with the low mist weaving between the headstones, and the sound of rain hitting the leaves was like a constant whisper. I walked slowly down the gravel path, dodging puddles, trying to keep my mind focused only on the reason for my visit. I reached the grave. The headstone was covered in small, dark water spots, and the oval photo of my grandfather watched me with that same serious gaze that always made me feel like he knew more than he let on. I placed the flowers, arranging them against the wind, and stood there, staring at the engraved name. It was then that, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a figure moving a few meters ahead, near a row of cypress trees. It was a tall man, wearing a dark overcoat and a worn hat. His graying beard fell over his chest, and his weathered skin made me freeze in place. My heart raced. That expression, it was identical to my grandfather's. Not similar, identical. The way he walked, with the slight swing of his arms and his upright posture, was something I remembered perfectly. I took a step toward him, but before I could call out, he turned sideways. Our eyes met for a second that felt like minutes. There was no doubt. Those eyes were the same ones that had once taught me to ride a bike, that had scolded me when I tried to lie, that had softened when telling bedtime stories. I blinked. That was all it took. A quick blink. When I opened my eyes, he was gone. No sign of footsteps, no shadow in the mist. Just the rain falling and the distant sound of a branch snapping in the wind. A shiver ran down my neck. The feeling of being watched didn't leave me, even as I turned my back on the grave and quickened my pace to the car. I tried to rationalize it. It could have been someone who looked like him, a visitor, or just my mind playing tricks. But deep down, something inside me said it wasn't a coincidence. As soon as I got into the car, my hands trembled on the steering wheel. I turned on the heater, but the cold seemed to come from within. I took a deep breath and continued driving down the wet road. The trees rushed past on either side, blurred by the rain, and the sound of the tires on the water created a constant noise that drowned out my thoughts. Then, a few kilometers later, I saw something ahead on the side of the road, a silhouette standing still, facing my direction. My stomach turned, the overcoat, the hat, the beard. It was him again. Instinctively, I hit the brakes. The car skidded, the tires screeching against the wet asphalt. My heart was pounding so hard I barely noticed the image transforming before my eyes. The figure moved, darted across the road in a quick leap, and disappeared into the woods. It wasn't my grandfather, it was a deer, its eyes reflecting the light of the headlights. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to catch my breath. But the confusion gnawed at me. What had I seen earlier? And why even now did I still feel that pressure in the air, as if something was there with me, inside the car, waiting for me to notice? I continued the drive home without further interruptions, but every shadow the rain cast on the window seemed to come alive for a second. When I finally parked in the garage, I had to sit for a few minutes, breathing deeply, trying to shake off that strange feeling that the visit to the cemetery hadn't ended there. When I entered the house, silence wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. I took off my soaked coat and left the keys on the table, but I couldn't shake off that uneasy feeling that had started at the cemetery. It was as if something had crossed through the gate with me and was now there, in the same space, watching my every move. I made some coffee trying to distract myself, but even the sound of the coffee maker seemed louder than it should have been, echoing in the kitchen. As I waited, I stared out the window, watching the rain beat against the glass. The reflection in the window showed me a tired face, and for an instant I could have sworn a second silhouette formed behind me. I turned so quickly I almost knocked over the cup. There was nothing, just the dark hallway leading to the living room. I drank the coffee sitting on the sofa, with the TV on some program I wasn't even paying attention to. The noise from the TV was just an excuse to avoid being alone with the silence. But no matter how hard I tried to focus, my mind kept returning to that figure in the cemetery and on the road. It didn't make sense. The night wore on, and the rain continued, now mixed with occasional thunder. I was almost dozing off when the landline rang. I looked at the clock. 11:47 p.m. At that hour, no one called me. I got up slowly, feeling my heart race for no reason. I picked up the phone. Hello? On the other end, silence. Not a normal silence, but a full silence, heavy, as if someone were breathing softly, almost imperceptibly. Then came a hiss, as if the line was filled with static. I was about to hang up, but a voice came through, weak, distorted. "My boy." My whole body froze. That voice, I knew it. It was hoarse, slow, with a deep tone I hadn't heard in years. "Who is this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's me." The static increased, and for a moment I thought I had misunderstood. But between the crackles, other words came, almost a whisper. "You shouldn't have gone." The call dropped. I stood there holding the phone, feeling my breath caught in my throat. I didn't wait long to try calling back. I called the operator service, asking them to trace the last call. The attendant was polite, but the answer was even more disturbing. According to the system, no call had been received that night. I hung up and stared at the phone as if it could give me some answer. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger. Only this time it didn't seem to come from outside. It came from within, from the room, from the living room where I was. I tried to convince myself to go to bed, but as I passed through the hallway, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. In the entrance mirror behind me, there was a shadow. It wasn't defined, but it had a human shape. The reflection moved when I stopped, but when I turned around, I only found the empty hallway. I closed all the doors, turned off the lights, and lay down. But sleep didn't come. With every noise in the house, my mind created images. Soft footsteps, someone breathing near the bed, the creak of a piece of furniture that shouldn't have been touched. I wanted to believe it was all just fatigue and the influence of that visit to the cemetery. But the memory of the voice on the phone haunted me. The way it said, "my boy," was exactly how my grandfather used to call me when he wanted to warn me about something serious. Around 3 in the morning, I was lying on my side, staring at the wall, trying to ignore the world. It was then that I heard a low sound coming from the living room, like someone was slowly running their fingers over the wooden surface of the table. I lay still, feeling my heart beat so hard it seemed like it wanted to escape through my throat. The sound stopped, and then the house plunged into absolute silence. But it wasn't peaceful. It was that same heavy, suffocating silence, like the one from the call. I turned in bed to reach for my cell phone and turn on the flashlight, but something made me freeze. In the reflection of the window, I saw a figure standing in the bedroom doorway. I didn't move. The rain beat against the glass, but all I could hear was my own accelerated breathing. I blinked, and the figure was gone. I lay there in the dark, too afraid to get up, and deep down I realized that perhaps the visit to the grave hadn't been just for me to remember him. but for him to remind me that he was still around, and that in some way, I was not alone. I would never be alone again. If you've stayed with me until now, I'd say you're already part of this little group that stares down every strange tale. So drop the phrase, "Grandpa in the cemetery," in the comments, so I know you made it to the very end. If you enjoyed going through these stories with me, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's coming next. There's always more bizarre stuff to tell, and make sure you hit the like button, because that's what keeps our conversation about the unexplainable alive. There's a video right here that's perfect for you to keep going. Click it and come with me. The next story is already waiting.